Okay, but before we dive into the plenary, I also wanted to thank our local host team, the Wisconsin Association for Floodplain Management, Floodplain, Stormwater, and Coastal Management for all of their incredible work in helping bring this as well. And in thinking about the 50th anniversary, being here in the home state of Wisconsin, for those of you that are not from Wisconsin, I'll basically say kind of 4 or 5 top things you need to do. Cheese curds, beer, brandy old fashions. Yes, brandy old fashions. I know some of you are bourbon, whiskey, whatever, and sausage. That's all I'm saying. So these are some of the staples here. And if you were yesterday at the exhibits grand opening or at Welcome Fest, the most massive cheese and massive meat trays I have ever seen at one of our conferences. So I think that in itself is wonderful. All right, so this opening plenary. The idea for this, I was kind of thinking about this a little bit, and the movie Back to the Future kind of came to mind, right? Because in some respects, we've got to pay attention to the lessons of the past in order to help us guide the future. And I think if we simply ignore that, we just blow things up without any reference to that, we are destined to repeat some of the same mistakes, have some of the same problems instead of moving forward in a positive direction. And what I'd like to do is ask the plenary speakers to go ahead and come on up here as we talk about that. But the theme of this plenary is to look back and look ahead at our nation's floodplain management policies. After more than 50 years of practice, what approaches have proven effective? Where have we fallen short? Looking forward, what do we need to do to reduce flood damages, build state and community resilience, and protect our floodplain resources over the next 50 years? And the other thing that I've asked the speakers to do is reflect also on where ASFPM, where our chapters, where our professional community intersects with that policy, and how we've either influenced that, hopefully for the good, but maybe also where we've fallen short. Now, one of the things that we've been doing at our plenaries for a number of years now, and I just want to introduce the concept, is on each of your tables you have note cards. I am the official note card pesterer of you. And so as you hear the plenary speakers talk, if you have a question that comes to mind, take a note card, write it down, and don't be afraid, hold it up. And we do have some runners, I believe, in the room, some volunteers that will grab them. They will take them to me because I'm going to be sitting off stage, and that will lead to a much better Q&A if all of you participate. So please get your questions in doing that. And I will remind you between speakers if I'm not seeing that many. So for logistics' sake and to be efficient, I'd like to actually introduce now all 4 of our speakers, and then they'll do their presentations back to back, and we'll end with questions and answers. Our first speaker is French Wetmore, and by the way, I've known all of these folks almost my entire career, and so just so honored to be up here with them. French started his floodplain management career working for small towns in central Illinois. He was a former state floodplain manager for Illinois. He formerly was the lead contractor to ISO during the first 25 years of the community rating system. Served as chair of the Regulations and Mitigation Committee before he was elected chair of ASFPM in 1985. He was on the first certification board of regents from 2000 to 2004, and French also has his own consulting firm, French & Associates, although he is now retired. However, French also has another distinction, and I think it's something that should be honored here. He is one of the founders of ASFPM, and in addition, he is our only person, I think, in this room that has attended every single one of ASFPM's past conferences. All right, so our next speaker is going to be Mark Riebeau. Now, I like it in the electronic thing, it kind of says NA, but then if you hit the button, you get a much longer bio there. But Mark, and he's going to tell you a little bit more in his own words, so I'll keep it very brief, but Mark has been involved in floodplain management since the beginning. He and Larry worked together in helping found this association. Mark also has been an active member of ASFPM, leading one of our policy committees, was one of our first staff project managers, and has worked in lots of different sectors, bringing a wealth of experience to us. So Mark Riebeau will be our second speaker. Then we have one of my fellow Okies. I am from Oklahoma, and so Okie is at least a fond term, I think, anyways. And that is Annie Mack Vest. Annie is the director of the Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management. Annie was a former state hazard mitigation officer. And in the private sector, she helped work with Tulsa to achieve a CRS Class 1. But Annie was also very active, and her roots are in floodplain management. She was very active in the Oklahoma Floodplain Managers Association, serving various leadership roles there, and becoming chair of OFMA as well in the past. And then finally, we have Dr. Lori Peak, and Dr. Peak is the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado, and ASFPM and the Hazard Center, and Lori will talk about this, have had a long history together, dating all the way back between the relationship that Larry Larson, ASFPM's founding executive director, had, and Dr. Gilbert White, who founded the Hazard Center that way. Lori's a professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, and to this day, the Natural Hazards Workshop is really the nation's premier workshop that tries to bring together academia, the policy community, and the practitioner community as well. So with that, I would like to go ahead and ask French to come up and kick us off. And again, remember the note cards. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chad. What I'd like to do is not focus on the fact that, as Chad reminds us, how old some of us are, but let's talk about the early years, 50 years ago. And I want to review some challenges we were facing, some responses, and a few of the people who were involved. First challenge, what do we do about flooding? That actually challenge predates ASFPM and predates the United States of America. A very interesting story, I understand, from 1543, a Spanish explorer in what was going to be the southern United States got stopped in his tracks by a flood on the Mississippi River. One of the members of his crew wrote this down for his history, and it sounds like a wonderful lesson, which of course we did not learn. What we did in the 1800s and 1900s was build in the floodplain. And what do you do when you're getting flooded? Obviously, you control the floodwaters. And that meant bigger channels, walls, levees, dikes, and what's going to happen next? More floods. Sometimes what you built wasn't big enough, there's damage. Sometimes what you built caused problems on other people, and there's damage. But that was the answer. In the 1900s, there was an interesting progression of flood, and then a federal act, then another flood, and then another federal approach to it, all of them with the words flood control. And you could see after a while, people started to think it's not really getting anywhere, not solving everything. So folks started talking about alternatives, and one of the key people who started this is a professor at the University of Chicago. Now, I know there's a lot of people here from Wisconsin, and I just wanted to advise you that Chicago is a city in Illinois just south of your state line, and you're going to, unfortunately for you, hear that name a few more times. So it wasn't just the professor, it was one of his key students whose name was Gilbert White. And the two of them worked in the federal offices in the 30s and kicked around some ideas that became the key to Gilbert's doctoral thesis, which says instead of adjusting floods to meet our desires, maybe we can adjust what we do in the floodplain. So that was kicked around along studies here and there, but actually the Tennessee Valley Authority decided to try some alternatives. What they did was they gave maps to local governments and some help to work on their planning and zoning so they could manage development in the floodplain. And this is where we found the first use of the term floodplain management. This was done by Jim Goddard, the leader of that. And those of you who've been in ASFPM more than a couple of years recognize the Goddard White Award, which is the highest award we can give floodplain managers, and it's named after those two leaders. One of the things they found when they looked at what they were doing is your work is not going to be successful unless you give the communities some help. Well, during the 1960s, things started picking up. In 1966, we had a unified national program, which was a document published by the federal government, but prepared by a task force of federal folks led and chaired by Gilbert White. And one of their recommendations was a national flood insurance program. We got that in 1968. In 1969, they looked at what was happening and they discovered that only 2 communities in the country actually had the maps and the regulations enough to qualify. So something else was needed, and what they did was create the emergency program, which said, okay, here's some almost good maps, and here's some minimum regulatory requirements, get in quick. Well, in '73, what happened? More floods. And they decided, or they take a look at things, and they saw that a lot of communities had not joined the flood insurance program, and in those communities that did join, a bunch of them had residents that got flooded that did not have insurance. So they came up with a solution in the Flood Disaster Protection Act, and that was the mandatory purchase requirement. This was a game changer. This meant every community that got a map had to do something, otherwise their residents would not be able to get financial assistance from the federal government, including federally regulated loans. Thousands of communities, and I use the word invited to join, they actually had a clock ticking on them to get in. So let's go to the setting of 1976. That was an important year for me because that was the year I became state coordinator. As Chad said, I had been working with communities on the NFIP. My office was in Chicago because that is where the flood problems were in the state of Illinois, and they had plenty. And they had hundreds of communities facing this issue of getting a map, what are we going to do? They also had, as in every other state, local officials and property owners who didn't really appreciate all of this, and that made our job obviously harder. Meanwhile, there were a variety of states that had mapping and or regulatory programs that didn't seem to be coordinated with the NFIP. In fact, there were 14 around the country, and you can see there's a concentration in the upper Midwest. The program was run at that time by the Federal Insurance Administration, and it had 10 regional offices. And the Region 5 had 6 states, 5 of which had mapping or regulatory programs. Region 5 had its office in Chicago. So those states were concerned about a variety of things, but in particularly the mapping program. And they voiced their complaints, and the Federal Insurance Administration listened and said, come on down for a meeting, and we met in Chicago at the regional office. But after those meetings, we all kind of went out to the bars and had our own talk and our own discussions on the side. And instead of saying, what are we going to do about flooding, we said, what are we going to do about this NFIP? In particular, the feds need to listen to us and recognize our programs. And in that discussions, there came an idea, what about if we formed an association and worked together? And that was kicked around, and then talked at another meeting, and talked again over the bars, and then talked at another meeting. Jim Wright, who was the state coordinator for Minnesota, at one of the meetings simply said, it's time to get off the pot. He pointed to each of us and said, do you want to have an association? And he went around the room, and it was unanimous. All 6 states said yes, and we became the Association of State Floodplain Managers. We had one more meeting in Chicago, and Region 5 again helped us out. But the next issue, the challenge is, okay, there's just us. It's a bigger issue than just the Midwest. How do we get other states involved? So in 1979, Minnesota hosted the first national conference. Every state coordinator in the country was invited. 15 made it at their own expense, including Alaska. And I remember talking with the Alaska State Coordinator and discovering his concerns were the very same concerns as the Midwestern states. In 1980, we had a conference in New Orleans, and this time we had a distinguished visitor, the Federal Insurance Administrator herself, Gloria Jimenez. I think we owe a lot to Gloria for two things she did. The first she did was recognize us. At her high position, not only should she say, I want to go meet with these people, she actually called us and asked us for opinions on our views. We did the same to her. We said, here's what we think. We think, Gloria, you ought to give the states some money, because there's a lot of states who would like to do it, but they don't have the finances. And she responded with the State Assistance Program. And so this is how you get more states involved. You give them the funds they need, and they join in. Well, also during this time, we adopted a constitution, became a little more formalized. Next challenge. We got more states involved, but how do we learn from each other? So in 1982, Larry Larson, who was the chair of the association and also the Wisconsin state coordinator, hosted the first conference that went beyond the National Flood Insurance Program and did more than just state people talking amongst ourselves. Also during this time, he started regular newsletters, got us incorporated, and at the end of his 3-year term as chair, he volunteered to be the executive director at no cost. You can't say no to that. And I'd like to note that, to be completely honest, we would have to put Larry's face on every one of the slides I'm showing you. Larry, by the way, is here over at this table, and you're welcome to say hi. Thank you. So, we got the states involved. How about communities? Les Bond was the state coordinator for Arizona. I'm not sure how active he was in the formation of the first state association, but he did have the best advice I've ever heard. He says, if you want to form a state association, you call a meeting, talk about it, and then you get out of the way. And state associations took off on their own, and we have many now. In fact, did it work? Well, let's see what happened. Since 1982, you can look at this map. Every state that is colored in has its own association or is a member of a multi-state association. We now have 32 of those associations that are recognized by ASFPM. They cover 44 states and the province of British Columbia, and they also have seats on the board of directors. So I think that's a pretty good measure of did it work. How about beyond the organizations and the governments? What about the floodplain managers themselves? The association was formed for the states, and so the association rules were in the 70s, only a state can vote, and only a state person can hold office. There were many folks who were active in the association who said, we'd like a bit more voice. And so they were actually, the best spokesperson was Janie Douglas. She was not a government employee. She was on her own pretty much, helping floodplain residents in Kentucky. And she reminded us that every time we saw her that you ought to extend the franchise, which we did in '88, when all members can vote and all members, regardless of their employer, can hold the office except for the top 4 positions. Did it work? Well, take a look at the numbers today. We have about 315 state employees, members of the association, and over 5,000 non-state members. We have, for every state member of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, we have 18 non-state members. We also have the non-state members in the majority of the office positions. So I think that kind of answers your questions. Did extending the franchise work? One thing it did is bring up interest in stuff that it was direct interest to individuals, and that was the Certified Floodplain Management Program. How many here are certified floodplain managers? I figured, yep, most of you. So I'm not going to explain it to you, but I will ask the question, did it work? Well, again, take a look at the numbers. We now have over 11,000 certified floodplain managers. which means for every every member of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, there are 2 CFMs. Not a bad ratio. Then in the 80s, we got into questions about, well, we've got this traditional 3-legged stool of the National Flood Insurance Program, mapping insurance and regulations. But what about other concerns like arid regions? Rules don't always work there. What about natural and beneficial floodplain functions? That was part of the Unified National Program, but it's not in the NFIP. What about other flood loss prevention measures like retrofitting or flood warning? What do you do when you have all of these questions at you? You form a committee, of course. We now have in ASFPM 16 committees that go from arid regions to stormwater management. And what they do is use 3 approaches to get the word out, to get people into implementing these things. And I'm going to call them inform, incentive, and in trouble. So let's look at each one. Obviously, what you want to start with is to inform community officials and property owners about these measures so they can do and implement them. We did it somewhat with our own publications, like this one on multi-objective management. But what we really did was have meetings, have workshops, have committees, and members picked up on what the messages were, and members went out and implemented their own public information activities at states, at regional agencies, local governments, nonprofit organizations, and private sector. Everything you're looking at on this screen was prepared by a member of ASFPM. So the next thing to do is, now that you've got the information, is to get people interested with them, and that's where you want to have an incentive, particularly for communities. And so the biggest incentive that came out since in the 90s was the community rating system, which provides insurance breaks if you start doing things above and beyond the NFIP. If you want to know what should you do, take a look at the table of contents for the coordinator's manual, and you'll see a pretty good list of the rest of floodplain management. And then, does that work? Well, we got 1,500 communities that have 70% of all the flood insurance policies. That means they probably have 70% of all the flood problems on properties in the country. So if that number of percentage of the communities are out there or in the program, I think they've concluded there's something worthwhile. And then the third way is to get communities into it is to tell them, you can do the minimum things, but if you issue a permit and as a result somebody gets flooded, they can sue you and you will be in trouble. That was the basis for the no adverse impact approach. That's the way it was originally planned out, but what it developed into is a major source of information and assistance for our members and for local officials, with guides that have talked about, here's the kind of things you can do above and beyond the NFIP. And there's more to come. So those have been the challenges that we've had to face, but only some of them. And I know Mark is going to get into some more. But I wanted to look at and summarize the responses. Number one, we expanded the franchise. We started as a state-only organization, and over the years, we got everybody on board to join us and participate and learn from us. We moved from the states against the feds to we're all in this together. It's not us versus them. The feds in the past have been very active, and federal agencies have supported us in great ways. We want to rely on information and incentives rather than mandates. And I think as a result of the work of this association, we do have better management of our floodplains. That means reduced flood losses. I think the first thing you're going to say is, wait a minute, everybody knows flood losses are increasing. And I'd have to agree with that and say, and caveat my statement, is that we have lower flood losses than we would have had if there was no ASFPM. And with that, I thank you very much. And Mark, I think you're next.
Thank you. So, when Chad called and asked if I would be a presenter at the plenary session, I said, sure. And then I said, why me? So I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, well, yeah, maybe I have had something to do with the association and floodplain management. And I did work for Larry from 1977 to 1989. And friends, to your point, when he decided to be a volunteer, non-paid volunteer executive director, that means he spent 80% of his time on the association and 20% of his time on the DNR activities, which left me with 120% of my time to do the work for the DNR. So that got me decided that after I got tired of that, I decided to go back to the greener pastures of the private sector, worked for SEH for 12 years, at which time we also managed to get SEH the first contract for doing flood insurance studies. Then Larry asked if I would like to come back to or work for the association directly as the first project manager, and that was really an intriguing idea. So I was really happy to do that, participate a little bit more in the association, and I'd like to think I had something to do with getting the Flood Science Center started and kicked off. So, but that was a short-lived duration because Michael Baker International had just won the contract to do map monetization around the country, and asked me if I would be willing to head up their regional management center that they're setting up for Region 10. And I thought, what a great opportunity. But I have to admit, I should say this, that opportunity probably wouldn't have taken up if our daughter didn't live in Portland, Oregon, and had just gotten married. And I want to say 9 months after we moved to Seattle, she had her first child and we had our first grandchild. So I worked for Baker in the Regional Management 10 office for 4 years, then there was a vacancy at the FEMA regional office for the branch chief for floodplain management and insurance, and I thought, great opportunity. And I will say this, when I worked for the state, when I worked for the federal government, I always felt like I was doing something more for the community as a public servant, even though in the private sector, most of the stuff I did was basically for local government. So let's go back to the beginning. The real beginning of the NFIP was the task force that was chaired by Dr. Gilbert White. It was not an insurance program, it was a land use program, where if the states would authorize the local governments to regulate land use, and because the federal government did not have the authority to regulate land use, only that was left to the states, and the states needed to authorize local governments to do that or require them, then the federal government would insure buildings that existed on the day the regulations went into effect. It was never anticipated that insurance would be made available for any new development once the regulations are imposed, because it's not going to be subject to flooding. It's going to be properly elevated or not located in the floodplain. Think about what a difference this country would be in if that had carried through. 1967, I was a student at the University of Wisconsin working on a degree in civil engineering when the Department of Natural Resources really got kicked off in Wisconsin. And two people came to town, Tom Lee and Larry Larson. Larry dragging his family across from California. He also dragged Anita with him, so I got to meet her then. And it's not what you know, it's who you know that's really important. So the NFIP was started, ran by HUD from 68 to 79 when FEMA was created. If you read really read the 44 CFR Part 60 is a real template for land use regulations. And one of the things that's really important is when you impose land use regulations, you have to explain to people where they are going to be applied. And the only way to realistically apply a zoning ordinance or a zoning rules and regulations is demonstrate where those regulations are going to be applied, and using a map is the only way to do that. So the initial mapping effort was the flood hazard boundary maps that were published pretty much nationwide. And I tell you the truth, they did an unbelievable job in a very short period of time getting maps across the country. Then they were followed up starting at about 1972 with flood insurance studies that created two maps. a map for insurance, the flood insurance rate map, and a map for regulations called the flood boundary floodway map. And there were different features on those maps. But that really what started the ASFPM, like French said before, the maps sucked. So then, some of the early wins, my memory is a little bit different than French's. I thought the start of Cap Sassy was 79, and I thought Gloria met with us in 78 in Chicago. That was the first meeting I attended, but regardless, I recall what Gloria Jimenez was saying was, we're gonna have the state assistance program, where the states assist HUD implement the program. And we said, no, yeah, well, we can do that if we have some staff, have some money to hire some staff. But the maps still sucked. In 1982, at the very first conference, the technical conference we held in Madison, excuse me, obviously there weren't as many people, so the field trip was, I think, 2 or 3 9-passenger vans that traveled around various places in Wisconsin, the Soldiers Grove and Prairie du Chien and other points. And we left at 7:30 in the morning and didn't get back until about 7:30 that night. And I drove one of the vans, and one of the people that rode shotgun was Dick Sanderson. Dick was in charge of the mapping program for FEMA. And I started on him when we left Madison at 7:30 in the morning, and I didn't let up until we got back at 7:30 at night. And I don't know if he was exhausted, but he agreed to initiate what's called the MAP Initiatives Project, the first MIP. So I won't get into all the details. I'm going to do that tomorrow afternoon at one of the concurrent sessions. But one of the things that few people realize is the flood hazard boundary maps were developed a combination of mapping. One was curvilinear, that is to say the floodplains followed the topography of the land, and the other was rectilinear, where the floodplain followed streets and highways or railroads. And guess what's one the insurance industry liked? The rectilinear. Who was in charge of the Flood Insurance Administration? Jeff Bragg, and a guy out of the insurance company, out of the insurance industry. Guess which map he wanted to publish? Rectilinear. Well, we had to convince him that first, you couldn't just do it by that method. First, you had to map each block based on the topography. Then you had to measure how much of that block was subject to flooding and how much was not. And then you'd have to redraw the map so that a city block that was more than 50% in the floodplain would be all in the floodplain, and one that was less would be out of the floodplain, and it would cost too much money. And that was the reason we now have maps published based on the topography. True story. So, 1993, there was the Great Midwest Floods. That implemented, as Fred pointed out, every big flood starts some new legislation. That kicked off the 1994 NFIP Reform Act. One of the provisions in that act was the Technical Mapping Advisory Council. Well, this was an advisory council created either by presidential executive order or by an act of Congress. Because it was created by an act of Congress, FEMA had to create it based on this act, it really got attention. We published reports that, every year for 5 years. I was really proud to have been nominated to serve by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I didn't represent ASFPM at that time. Brian Hyde, who was the chair of the Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee, represented ASFPM. But they elected me as the chair at the very first meeting, and I was just pleased to have been chaired that entire area. And one of the kudos I want to point out to SEH, they allowed me the time and didn't force me to take vacation time to serve on this. And we spent a lot of time. So what did we come up with? Well, first, back in the 80s, under the Reagan administration, they thought that this program should be self-funded. So they expected that all the costs of the program, including mapping, would be paid for out of the insurance fund. They still didn't realize that the only people that buy flood insurance are the people that have to by their bank, or people who have been flooded and are going to get flooded, know they're going to get flooded again. It's a very small part of the population, and you can never make the rates actuarial because it's just, simply impossible. So one of the big recommendations was, let's get some funding into the program so we can fund flood insurance studies and really get the maps brought up to date. generate public support for this program. And what we didn't call it the cooperating technical partners, but we did say we need to reach out to other states, other universities and so forth, and that became known as the cooperating technical partners. The big item was go digital. Now that may sound funny, but maps were still being made manually. By scribe code. It was a labor-intensive process. I'll describe a little bit more of that in my concurrent session, but to go digital seemed enormous, but it didn't. It was one of the recommendations. So the TMAC reports basically led and incentivized Congress to fund MapMod, which is really good. And again, that was also generated much by the association here. So where are we now? Well, ASFPM is still advocating for better maps, still advocating for mitigation, still a trusted voice on the Hill. FEMA, I don't know. I think what we all need to do is really get ready to go it alone. Communities, you need to go back, and the local officials need to step up the game. State officials need to step up the game, but the private sector folks out here, this is where you really have a role to play. They can't go to their mayor and ask for more money. You've got to go to the mayor and tell them they need more money, they need more staff, they need more support. When a flood comes in, you're going to need to be prepared to pick up the pieces, because the feds are not going to be there to help. States, same way with the states. Talk to your governor, talk to your elected officials at the state level and say, this is an important program that needs to be funded and it needs to be supported. So, thank you.
Well, good morning. I don't have slides today, and I guess I'm the future of this because I certainly did not know all of that history. So, gentlemen, thank you. I want to start by thanking our speakers before me for reflecting on this profession. And from what I've learned in my own career, there's no better place than to do this than a room full of people who have lived these things. You're going to have to indulge me for a minute because I do want to talk about Tulsa, because it matters, looking back and learning from history and the people that came before us on what we do moving forward from here. I'm from Nebraska, but I consider myself now to be from Tulsa because I've grown up in Tulsa professionally. If you work in floodplain management long enough, eventually somebody will tell you to go study Tulsa. Not because Tulsa got everything right, but because Tulsa was doing these things and preaching the good word of mitigation and implementing floodplain management long before there was any federal program in place. Tulsa decided that floodplain management wasn't going to be a side issue for them, and it's not today. It became part of our city's DNA, part of how we think about growth, infrastructure, parks, drainage, public safety, and long-term resilience. And long before I understood what any of that meant, I had the privilege of learning from the people who built it. People like my former boss, Ron Flanagan, who studied under Gilbert White, former Public Works Director, Charles Hart, legendary mitigation professional, Ann Patton, City of Tulsa Mayor Terry Young. As an early 20-year-old, I sat in rooms listening to them describe neighborhoods that flooded over and over again, difficult political decisions, political exile when the developers were winning, buyouts before buyouts were common, pushing for stronger standards when nobody wanted to hear it, and building public trust. Those conversations shaped me. The stories, when you read them, have been a bit romanticized over the years, but they matter. I started working on Tulsa's mitigation program in 2012, and at that time, I really didn't appreciate what I was stepping into, but I do today. Tulsa was never just a Class 1 community rating system score. That's not what they sought out to be. That was just a benefit to the work that they were doing. It was never just drainage projects, maps, or ordinances. It became our culture, a culture where mitigation matters, floodplain management has a seat at the table, long-term thinking survives election cycles, and people understand that projects represent someone's home, someone's business, and someone's future. In 2021, I had the honor of helping lead the consulting effort that helped get Tulsa to a Class 1. And the Class 1 was great, but it was more important what it represented, is the dedication of decades of consistency, institutional knowledge, and of people doing hard work before anyone was really paying attention. And that's the foundation I'm standing on. It might surprise some of you given the role that I hold. I'm the executive director of the Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management. That's a state emergency management position. I'm also a certified floodplain manager. That combination is not common, but it should be, because floodplain management and emergency management are not separate professions that occasionally collaborate. They're two sides of the same mission, and I want to encourage everyone in this room, whatever discipline that you sit in, to lean into the nexus, to learn the language on the other side and build relationships across those swim lanes before the disaster occurs. The communities that need us and the people that need us don't understand and don't care and don't experience the fact that we have these professional boundaries. They just experience the flood. Before I get started about the future, I really want to lean into the present, and I want to acknowledge something. It's been acknowledged by most of the speakers this morning. The last year has been hard. It's been hard for communities, it's been hard for states, it's been hard for FEMA, it's been hard for our citizens, it's been hard for a lot of people in this room. The programs that we've counted on have been delayed. Funding that communities were depending on sat with uncertainty for months. Staff at every level worked through conditions that none of us would have chose. And practitioners showed up anyways and kept doing the work. I've watched colleagues navigate that with extraordinary professionalism. We've lost some of the best FEMA employees that we could have hoped that would be with us moving forward. We've seen the disruptions. But something that I found in the last year in my role as Emergency Management Director for the state of Oklahoma is something I didn't expect. That among all of the chaos, I found clarity. Clarity is what this profession is actually made of, and it's what local and state capacity really means when that federal certainty wavers. Clarity about what we need to build so that communities are never entirely dependent on any single system or any single resource moving forward. I don't have a crystal ball for what's going to happen with FEMA, but I'm hopeful. I've taken clarity as an opportunity in my state, and I'm hoping many others have as well. I know what I don't want the next 50 years to look like. I don't want another generation of practitioners sitting, still waiting for federal reform to catch up with the last big disaster. Last fall, I had the opportunity to participate in a closed-door session of the FEMA Review Council prior to the public meeting in Oklahoma City. And what struck me most was not where states disagreed. It was where they agreed, that mitigation is a priority, that we need more flexibility, that there needs to be less red tape, and that a system that trusts states as partners rather than managing them as recipients is what is best for this nation. Those are not new ideas, and they're operational realities for all of us. This room has known it for years. The value of a process like the Review Council, it doesn't mean that the report and the recommendations are perfect, but it gave an opportunity for structured, credible feedback into what reform needs to look like. This is how systems improve without waiting for a catastrophe to force the issue. Feedback is how this profession has always moved the needle. We cannot stop giving it. But the federal reform is not the whole answer, and that brings me to the part I want to be the most direct about. We talk about FEMA as if they are the be-all and end-all when it comes to disasters, when it comes to mitigation, and when it comes to funding. And they are not, and they have not been. FEMA is first in and first out. We need them. They are a critical part of the disaster cycle, but they're part of a bigger system, and we've done a poor job of managing that expectation with our citizens and the communities that we serve. I think about federal disaster assistance, and I recently explained it to Chris Curry at GAO as a federal hourglass, if you will, where the federal programs funnel down through a coordination hub to the state and then out to communities. That coordination hub, the federal coordinating officer, bringing all of those resources to the table. The National Disaster Recovery Framework actually functioning the way it was designed. That's where recovery either works or it doesn't. And when it works, communities move. When it doesn't, you get what I see too often in my job every single day. Every person at the federal level stays in their box or in their lane. Funding comes at different times with different requirements, and communities are overwhelmed. And this is not a criticism. It's a structural problem, and it has real consequences in our communities. I want to give you an example of a community in my state that's a town of 5,000 people that will put this into perspective for you. In 2024, a tornado and a flood struck a community and devastated a downtown. And when the president tweeted his support, that meant something to them. In the town of that size, the kind of attention means everything. But the help wasn't helpful, not in the way that people needed. People thought they would be made whole. They never are. It's a mismanagement of expectations that follows almost every major disaster in this country. When FEMA arrived, the process was confusing, the paperwork was overwhelming, and the community itself was left navigating 30+ grant programs, multi-agency coordination, contractor oversight, and daily city operations with one city manager. What kept the community moving was not the federal assistance. It was citizens who cared about their town and a city manager willing to help work himself to the bone, and they had hope. We had a FEMA community planner embedded just to help them with their community planning mechanisms because their planning commission and zoning board was so old. We lose sight of how much the simple things matter after a disaster occurs: the governance, the local systems, the institutional capacity to make decisions and execute them. In the 20 months since that event, the community has made 158 governance decisions, secured $22.5 million in confirmed funding with $38 million more in the pipeline. And when you look at where that money actually came from, a fraction of the money was from FEMA. SBA loans, community development block grants, state grants, congressional earmarks, bridge financing. FEMA's not the biggest funder in the room, and they never were. And until communities understand that before a disaster, we'll keep surprising them after. Mitigation, funding, building codes, floodplain ordinance, all of those things matter, but we don't talk enough about what actually happens when that money arrives and there's nobody left standing to implement. The implementation gap is real, it's widespread, and it defines recovery outcomes for the next generation of disasters more than any size of individual grant award. In emergency management, we talk a lot about swim lanes. Who does what before an event? Those lanes exist for good reasons when they need to, but swim lanes that serve us so well before, during, and after disaster become walls during recovery. Recovery from a flood does not fit inside any single agency's mission, and if you don't believe you have a seat at the table, you're incorrect. It doesn't respect organizational charts. It requires every smart mind available, every sector, every relationship, every public, private, nonprofit, tribal, faith-based, civic organization. You may have heard this described as a hub and spoke model, a coordination center with strong connections. It's the whole community. It's a phrase we've used often, but we've applied it too narrowly in this space. Whole community in recovery means the economic development director, the floodplain administrator, the chamber of commerce, the hospital system. They're all at the table. They all have a role. Communities that recover fastest are not the ones with the most federal funding. They're the ones with the strongest networks. And why is this important? Because disasters are the opportunity we have right now to mitigate before the next one. The next 50 years will belong to the communities that stop treating flood disasters as if they are a surprise. That requires stability, not the stability of doing things the same way, the stability that comes from building systems and using technology strong enough to change. In administration and staffing doesn't send a community back to, that a change in administration or a gap in staffing doesn't send that community back to square one. We see this time and time again. Technology is moving faster than many communities can keep up with. And if we're not intentional, we risk creating a new version of a problem in this country, a digital divide between communities with access to modern flood risk tools and those without. I know in my state, we have some communities that don't have maps at all. Large municipalities have GIS teams, data scientists, real-time flood monitoring. Small and rural communities, often those with the greatest risk and the greatest recovery burden, are making infrastructure decisions on outdated data, managing grants and spreadsheets, and navigating very complex federal systems with staff that have already been stretched past their limits. I'm certain this applies to some of you in the room. Technology in the next 50 years can be the great equalizer, but only if we make it one. States have a role in bridging that gap, and the federal system has to stop designing programs that assume the level of technological sophistication that most communities don't have. Alongside of that, over the next 50 years, and when we think about what the next 50 years hold, we need to fundamentally change how we measure success in recovery and mitigation. For too long, mitigation has been evaluated by compliance. Did the community submit the right documentation? Did it have a benefit-cost ratio that met a threshold? Those things matter, but compliance in the next 50 years has to be the floor and not the ceiling. Mitigation professionals of the next 50 years need to be focused on outcomes. How many structures are no longer in the floodplain? How many households have measurably lower risk? How many communities recovered faster because the investments we made before the storm? We're very good at measuring what we fund. We're not nearly good enough at measuring what we change. That has to shift, and the people in this room are the ones that can shift it. It can't stop at the state and local level. The federal system has to be focused on outcomes too. I think about this often in my role. Imagine what would be possible if a state receives $3 billion to recover and can actually plan towards the end result without the constant fear of compliance, tripping up every decision, without hearing you can't do that at every turn from someone sitting in a box 3 levels removed from the community that they are supposed to be serving. Imagine being able to ask, what does the community look like in 10 years if we get this right? And then building a program designed to get there, rather than designing a program around what the federal rule book would tolerate. The resources are there, the need is there. What's missing is the trust that states and communities, given flexibility and accountability for outcomes, will make good decisions for the people they serve. I believe they will, and I've seen it. I still carry those Tulsa lessons with me, the stories that Ron Flanagan told, the lessons that Ann Patton shared, and the wisdom that she brought to hard conversations. They remind me this is not just technical work, it is public service. And public service at its best means deciding that the way we are doing things is not good enough, and then doing the long, unglamorous, hard work and making them better. This is what the profession has done for the past 50 years. And the last 50 years proved what floodplain management can do. The next 50 will determine what communities can become. Resilience can't just be a grant, it's a decision that the community has to make before the storm. And with that, I'm hopeful that my dear friend, Dr. Lori Peek, will transition us into an optimistic and positive future. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It is great to see you, and thank you so much to this extraordinary panel. It is an honor to be up here. As Chad said, my name is Lori Peek, and I'm a professor of sociology, and the honor of my professional life is that I direct the Natural Hazard Center, which was established by Dr. Gilbert White in 1976, and it serves as the nation's National Science Foundation designated information clearinghouse for the societal dimensions of hazards and disasters. What we stand for is bringing together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to reduce the harm and suffering from natural hazards. I read a book once that said, when you're speaking to audiences, that you have about 45 seconds to capture their attention, and then their attention plummets. And so I wanted to say in my first 45 seconds that if you take one thing from this talk today, I hope it's this: people, people, people. Repeat after me: people, people, people. I'm here today to talk to you about what it might look like if in the future we move toward a people-first flood risk reduction approach to research, practice, and policy. First, though, I want to wish a happy anniversary to the Association of State Floodplain Managers. "51 years ago, Gilbert White led the first assessment of natural hazards in the United States, and tucked away on page 253 of that assessment were some words that I think he wrote holding Larry Larson, French, Mark, and other founders in mind. He said that to promote sound floodplain management in this nation, we need one institution, perhaps an association, that brings together federal, state, local, and private sector to, quote, give direction and encourage the exchange of findings. I give thanks for the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and as French said, I shudder to think about where we would be in 2026 if it were not for all of you and the work that you do. It is acknowledged and it is recognized and it is deeply felt, and this country is different because of all of you and the work that you do. Chad, I am so grateful to you for the invitation to stand up here today. And Chad asked me to speak specifically to the past, present, and future in terms of the academic research enterprise and our connections to floodplain management practice and policy. And so to begin, the past. In the first assessment of natural hazards in the United States, one of the key pieces or contributions that Gilbert and his colleague, sociologist Jean Haas, wrote about in the introduction to the book included this. They wrote, quote, research today concentrates largely on technologically oriented solutions to problems of natural hazards, instead of focusing equally on the social, economic, and political factors which lead to non-adoption of technological findings. In short, the all-important social, economic, and political, what Gilbert called the people factors, involved in hazards reduction have been largely ignored. They need to be examined in harmony with the physical and technical factors. So repeat after Gilbert. It's the people, people, people. Fast forward to the present, 50 years on from where Gilbert, writing 50 years past, argued over and over and over again that we are too often looking for a technical fix that is really, again, a social, political, and economic problem. And so in the present, today, we have had 50 years of extraordinary progress in terms of understanding those all-important people factors. Thanks to collaborations across research communities, including the social and physical sciences, engineering, the humanities, public health, and beyond, we now know an incredible amount about who is most at risk to flood hazards and other natural hazards, and where the most exposed and socially vulnerable populations live. Thanks to efforts like FEMA's flood hazard mitigation mapping programs, the estimates range from about 15 million people living in the 1 in 100 floodplain to more recent research using larger and more robust data sources that argue that perhaps as much as 13 to 15% of our nation live in the floodplain. We also know so much more about how people are impacted in flood disasters in terms of their physical and mental health, educational outcomes, business closures, and many other issues in both the short and longer term aftermath of disasters. We also know a lot about why groups, and especially the most socially and economically marginalized groups, struggle to mitigate and prepare for flood hazards. And hint and word to the wise, it's not about lack of knowledge or lack of care, that all too often it's about a lack of resources, a lack of capacity, or a lack of support at that all-important local level. We also, speaking to Gilbert's call for more focus on the social, political, and economic factors, know a lot about why powerful actors, decision makers, developers, and others in society often engage in what people working from a political economic position of understanding risk talk about as the social production of risk, rather than in engaging in risk reduction efforts. And it's important to understand that sort of risk build up and how and why that is occurring, just as we're trying to understand how to mitigate the risk. And so we've made a lot of progress, but we still have many, many, many open questions that need to be answered, including we need to understand more about approaches that actually work in terms of encouraging public participation and the speeding up of adoption of what Gilbert used to refer to as wise adjustments, wise use in the floodplain. So we need to learn more about what is actually working in communities. We need to document that, and we need to figure out how to share those lessons across communities. And again, giving thanks for ASFPM for doing so much of this vital work. So the future. Where are we turning? And this is actually a question for all of you, because you are the leaders in the field. You are the ones who are working up close on these issues. From my perspective of where I sit, I hope that the future is going to be grounded in a people-first approach to flood risk reduction. This doesn't mean that the structures don't matter. It doesn't mean that understanding the flood hazard doesn't matter. It means that it all matters together. We must understand the built, natural, social, and economic environments and how they operate together. But in all of this, we must remember that it is people at the center of the why for the work that we do, and that it's all of you, the people who are doing the work, that are also at the center, and you must remember to care for yourselves as you care for others. And so a people-first approach to flood risk reduction. What could this actually look like? And so here I want to draw on a case from the brilliant recent Dr. Coyote Toba from Texas A&M University, who's now a research professor there. And he works with a large and robust team in their Disaster Resilience Institute at Texas A&M University, where they are working across communities to address the problem that we all know is at the center of so much of what we are trying to address, which is communities, and especially those that are rural, isolated, or under-resourced in a variety of ways. They lack the data, the tools, and the technical expertise to advance the best practices for flood risk management that this community has been establishing for decades. And so what's happening, one potential solution, of course there are myriad solutions, but the solution that the DRIP program, or the Disaster Resilience Information and Partnership, what a great acronym, at Texas A&M University, is actually building deep collaborations between researchers, residents, and decision makers, those powerful actors, in order to advance flood data gaps, to fill those gaps, and to advance flood risk reduction efforts. And it's worth noting that this program is funded by the Texas legislature, and it includes bipartisan support. And so there are possibilities, there are so many possibilities out there for us to work together across divides and across barriers when we're doing this good work. And so what are they doing through the DRIP project that I think is so transformative and so important for us to think about in their people-first approach to flood risk reduction? And so they are concerned with the fact that many rural communities across Texas, they don't have data. So they may not have maps or data at all, or the maps or data that they have may be decades out of date, and so not speaking to current climate and population conditions in the places where floods can occur. And so they want to have better, more robust information about people, property, and critical infrastructure that's at risk, because they recognize this is fundamental to developing flood resilience. And so what DRIP has been doing is they're working across communities in the state of Texas, is they're combining the need for technical support with community input. Again, the people, people, people. And so what they're doing to help make flood risk visible and hence actionable is they're combining the cutting edge technologies that Annie spoke to, like using high resolution imagery to help create maps for communities that don't have them. Well, at the same time, they're going door to door and visiting communities where they have either experienced floods or they know that they are a risk to floods, but they know that the maps that they currently have do not reflect that risk. And guess what? When they knock on those doors, they may be looking for collaborations to collect data, but what they're actually doing is building trust and building networks as they're developing these richer datascapes for communities that need it most. They're also collecting georeference photos from people, and they're merging this in broader data sets to help understand, again, present and potential future flood risk. So they've assessed this program, and one of the things that they've learned from the community members is that they feel heard, which again is central to these efforts. Rather than walking into a room and telling people what we know, it's so important to start by asking about what people know and what they care about and what they're concerned about. And so people feel heard when they participate in this program, and in the end, they feel empowered with the new data, tools, knowledge, and information that's being shared with them. People, people, people. And so a people-first flood risk reduction effort, it also is akin to a three-legged stool, but with three different legs. And so the first leg to such a stool involves centering people in all the things that we do, centering their knowledge, their experiences, their strengths, their fears, their capacities, and their actions that they can take, they have taken, or that they would take with the proper tools, resources, and expertise. Second, it is vital that we include population characteristics, so information about people when we're modeling things, when we're calculating things related to flood risk exposure, vulnerability, and impacts. And third, through engaging in this sort of people-first approach to flood risk reduction, we can promote necessary, vital compassion, care, recognition, dignity, and respect that people demand and people need and people deserve who are living in this ever more turbulent and ever more risky world. We care about people at the Natural Hazards Center. You care about people in the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and you have the potential to transform, literally transform people's lives through what you know and what you do, and I give thanks for each of you. Thank you.
Whew. 4 outstanding presentations. Another round of applause for our speakers. All right, and thanks to a couple of you that have given me note cards. I probably have enough questions at least for the remainder here. Annie, you had a comment that I wrote down. I think it's my favorite quote of the conference so far, and I may not have gotten it all right. In the next 50 years, I don't want it to be like the last 50 years, which is waiting for federal reforms and changes. We need to lead. And a couple of the questions have kind of this theme to it. And so my question really to all of you is, what does that look like? What might that look like in terms of innovative state or local government funding? Or how do we encourage people to speak up and speak out in continuing floodplain management in a positive way? And so anybody would like to go first?
I'll go at it from the state perspective because I think it's important on the government side. When FEMA kind of froze up this year, we saw a lot of people looking like deers in headlights, and it triggered a lot of anxiety, and it gave the clarity to really stop looking at ourselves as these individual units. And when I say whole community, my office, for example, I am 91% federally funded, so I was an incredible risk of my entire agency shutting down, but I work in a state where we have 32,000 state employees, and so I can look at other agencies and focus on pulling engineers from another entity and pulling subject matter expertise that may not otherwise exist. And I really learned that coming from the private sector at an engineering firm that has those same types of capabilities. So I think reaching across the swim lanes is important. There's too many times where we have people saying, that's not my job, that's theirs, and that has to stop or we're gonna get stuck right where we are.
Okay. Anybody else?
It's basically a political question. It is time for everyone to understand that government is not a business. It shouldn't be run like a business. It is to provide the services that we need that private enterprise can't provide and make profitable. When we, as a community, understand that these programs are really to help all of us, but it requires investment at government levels, at all levels, local, federal, and state, to try to improve the processes. That's when we'll begin to make progress.
I think if you ask what's it going to look like, I think we're looking at it. This association is a model of people from different areas talking to each other, kind of like off the record. You have a beer, you meet at a meeting, you talk at a session like this, and people understand what the other perspectives are and that we really all have a common objective. And I think that's something that this group can do and continue to do to get the various factors, when they're allowed to attend, to talk this kind of stuff through.
Okay, all right. Lori, the Hazard Center and ASFPM have mutually supported one another for 50 years. Moving into the future, what are the new and different ways that organizations can work together to advance flood risk reduction and floodplain management? And I know that actually, I know Annie has worked with other organizations too, so all of you can answer, but give Lori the first shot at that.
Okay. Thank you, Chad. So I think to that question, it also ties into the first question about the next 50 years and what is this going to take to actually make progress on the key indicators that we care about in terms of reducing flood risk and hazards risk much more broadly. That I think it's going to take building much, much stronger and more robust coalitions. And so the Hazard Center and the Association of State Floodplain Managers were both born out of that common concern and a special concern with flood hazard risk. But as we're moving into the future, an ever more uncertain future, it's going to take building partnerships with organizations, non-traditional organizations, that stopping and thinking about who is in our community that doesn't think of themselves as a partner to flood risk management, but they need to be at the table. Is it the local schools? Is it the local community development, business groups? Who is it in your community that's central to your community, but has never even thought about what it means to have a flood map? Those are the people that we need at the table and in these conversations. So I think that's it. It has to be a new vision that is much more diverse, bold, robust, and inclusive across a variety of organizations and not just our usual suspects, because it really is going to take all of us.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
I think, especially right now where we are with the FEMA reform, we have to stop looking at the group that's the obvious group to look to when we're trying to talk about reform. So the FEMA Review Council, for example, while it did some great work, was primarily built up of emergency managers. And emergency managers are not the ones that are going to solve most of these issues. We need the technical experts at that table in order to really just stop band-aiding the broken system that we have.
Okay. You know, and one of the things that has been a delightful new partnership that even ASFPM has undertaken in the last year is kind of discovering the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a whole resilience coordination mechanism, and they have been an absolute delight to work with that way. And I think about, you know, how many Chamber of Commerces we have all over the country, and how those are folks that typically maybe aren't at the table, but need to be. So it was mentioned a couple times. This has been a pretty high anxiety year, and there's some folks that are here that are maybe earlier in their careers or not quite have experienced that kind of anxiety. And for all the panelists, I'd be curious your perspective. Certainly, French and Mark, you've had a lot of experience, been through ups and downs, but like, what's your piece of advice to get us through, you know, kind of these kinds of times into, you know, the future that we want to see?
Yeah, I was reminded of 1985 when I was elected chair at the conference. We had a grand total of 2 representatives of FEMA allowed to attend. We were at kind of a bottom point of relations with FEMA for a variety of reasons. And we did 2 things. The first was we went to Washington and kept talking to FEMA. He listened. The head of the FIA was Jeff Bragg, a pure insurance person, which kind of raised the concerns of all the rest of us, but he listened and he talked and he was always honest and open. And I think once you do it on a face-to-face basis and you're not representing the organizations, you are representing what you both have as a common objective, you can talk. That said, the other thing we did was go to Congress and explain to the various staffs what we do and what was happening. And it kind of culminated in a vote by Congress where what Jeff Bragg wanted to do was make the program self-supporting by raising the cost of premiums. And a lot of us were concerned that that meant harder life on our residents and what happened to the subsidized flood insurance that was promised. What happened with Congress was they basically said there's a 10% cap on any rate increases. And both sides celebrated a victory. Jeff got his rate increase, not as much as he wanted. We got the message across that Congress can yank his chain, for lack of a better phrase. And I think those actions are possible things you want to kick around right now for dealing, again, a face-to-face basis of people to people, which I will keep remembering, people to people to people.
Okay.
I think this association in particular, has a voice that's listened to on the Hill more than any other professional organization, because you represent the states and that unique relationship between the federal government and the state government. You can be more helpful in helping others by spending more time on the Hill, talking to the members of Congress and explaining the dire dilemma that we all face. I think, quite frankly, this association is uniquely situated to be able to help move the needle forward in a positive way.
Okay, so last question for the group, and this is kind of maybe an easy one. And I reserve the moderator's right to actually respond to this too, because I liked it. Please recommend a favorite book about floodplain management for lay people. And I'll even say, expand that. If you don't have one for floodplain management as either a working professional in the disaster field or something that you've read that you particularly like.
As a person who loves books, carries them as my emotional support book, I think I would recommend Kai Erikson, a fellow sociologist, his classic book, Everything in Its Path, that was published in 1976 on the 1972 Buffalo Creek floods in Appalachia. And it was the first book that really put forward a recognition of the trauma that floods can cause for communities and how that trauma is much deeper than individual, that when floods break up communities, that is when the trauma can really set in, and the things that we can do to resist those impacts is vital. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
One of my favorite books has nothing to do with floodplain management, but it has to do with our understanding of how we've come to believe in things and what we believe is critical to what we do. And I'd recommend this book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. If I could only pronounce the author's name, I would, but it has really helped me understand why some people do what they do, including myself. So it's not an easy read, but it's educational.
Okay. Annie or French?
I would recommend, every state practically has its own handbook on floodplain management. You saw a picture of the Louisiana one. That is a monster book. But if you're going to be an actor, you got to know your stuff. And that, if you go with that book inside and out, you need it to pass the CFM exam anyway. I would recommend becoming the expert in your field and then remembering that it's part of a bigger picture and you're going to contribute to it. You're not going to run the whole thing. But the thing you contribute is your expertise and experiences.
Okay.
I have nothing to add to this conversation.
No. You know what reminded me early in my career where Peter Finkay, our state floodplain program manager in Ohio, put 44 CFR 60.3, put it on my desk, and he's like, "You will know this better than FEMA will." And that was, but I can tell you that is not a favorite read, but a favorite, and I was curious if it would be on here. I've read it twice, and especially in times when I'm looking for inspiration. But it is Living with Nature's Extremes, The Life of Gilbert Fowler White, and he's been invoked a lot, but he really is, I mean, when you read his story and the stuff he went through, it makes it look like what we've gone through is almost nothing. So with that, again, thank you all panelists so much, really, really appreciate it. And now what I'd like to do is invite Jeff Davis up for some announcements. Jeff.